Hi everyone. For today's class, what we'll be doing is a review of Vellum's book, but specifically reviewing the book with reference to the book report guidelines. So basically, I'm going to walk with you through the guidelines, beginning kind of at the top of the paper and working your way down. So if you kind of see what's going on, we start with kind of a general conversation about the key ideas about the book, the summary, and then we get more specific as we go through the paper. So just keep in mind when writing the paper, the different requirements in terms of page requirements, in terms of citing and using the text. These are things that, should be, easy to do by now if you've taken craft of sociology. Just a little refresher, you cite the text, so you use the text to not only support your ideas, but you also cite and use text to show the reader where they can go find that information in the book. In other words, if I'm going through your paper and I see something that I find interesting or something that I want to read more about, then I could use your citation, specifically the page numbers, the page number, where the quote comes from, where the paraphrase comes from, and then I can go back into the book and find that information. So overall, make sure you're using the text, as you're going through the paper, and always use the text to highlight and support your ideas. And regards to the page requirement, as long as you're answering everything fully, kind of fully developing your ideas, then you should be in good shape. In other words, the paper is kind of organized to be, a certain amount of pages. And if you go over that amount, that's fine. But at minimum, you should be reaching that minimum page requirement. And it should be easy to do as long as you're answering every part of the paper. And, my approach to that is, never assume that the reader has read the book. Never assume the reader has read the article. So when you have that in mind, you're not going to stop short at all, but rather fully explain your ideas, because you recognize that the person won't know what you're talking about unless you fully explain your ideas. So beginning with the summary here, the question basically is, how would you explain the main ideas of the book to someone who's not familiar with the text? So here I think we're looking at maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs, give or take. And, here you're talking about, the type of theory being put forth, kind of the main ideas within the arguments. And so a general kind of overview, and they'll get more specific into the theory in the next parts. So typically, again, everybody does okay with the summary, just as long as you're kind of highlighting what type of theory we're looking at and some of the key ideas within the theory itself. So the next 3 parts, I call the kind of working dynamics of theory. So here it gets a little bit more difficult compared to the reaction papers we've been doing. The reaction papers basically follow the what, how, and why formula. Here I ask you to pay attention a little bit more to those elements of agency, to structural forces in play that creates the action in the framework. So overall, there are a lot of different forces in play, both forces of agency, forces of social structures. But if you had to identify kind of one driving element for Vellum, what would that be? And this is something we talked about. This is something we talked about kind of in the first lecture, going over Vellum's book. Basically, we get into the what he's trying to explain and the how. And kind of that first part of the how, we highlight that driving force. Vellum believes that people have these instincts, these innate desires to compete and dominate other people. In doing so, you create that social stratification. And so those instincts, those innate desires have always been there, but they just play out differently according to the history in which people find themselves. So kind of keep that in mind in terms of that driving force. And again, use the text, use the book to support your thoughts, to support your arguments here. So again, still looking at those kind of working dynamics of the theory, kind of taking it up a notch in terms of abstraction, also in terms of difficulty. Here we get into the structure and agency. So I specifically asked for 2 examples of this relationship between structure and agency. So you could focus on how social structures are shaping kind of what people are doing. So in other words, you could look at how culture provides people basically a measurement stick, and people use that measurement stick to place people in different class categories. And so again, what you're seeing is how culture as a structural force is shaping kind of the mind of people by kind of letting them use the measurement stick to place people in one class position or another. But so the agency is there, it's just kind of constrained within the social structure, that people still have to have the awareness of the measurement stick, the ability to kind of make the decisions to put people in one position or another. So again, you have agency kind of responding to the culture, the placing people in class positions, responding to the cultural measuring stick. And you can look at other forces as well. Capitalism of modernity kind of dictates people focusing on wealth, focusing on property, more so compared to the past in kind of pre-capitalist eras. We can look at groups. So, the groups to which you belong are important here, because basically you kind of look up, to the groups above you. And so the leisure class members, kind of look above themselves to other leisure class members, while Veblen argues if you're part of the working class, you not only focus on the leisure class, but you compare yourself within your own class boundaries as well. So, you can look at capitalism, you can look at culture, you can look at structures, all of these things, or you can look at groups. All these things represent social structures that come into play that kind of relate to agency. And the agency is when you capture that awareness. You're aware of that cultural measurement stick. You're aware that wealth and property are key symbols of a capitalist system. And then also kind of playing the game. A lot of the agency in Veblen's book is about how people kind of learn the game as kind of taught to them through cultural socialization, but they learn to play it, and they can play it in different ways. Your consumption practices, your leisure practices, your work practices. So that's what I'm looking for. It's basically 2 examples of how social structure shapes thoughts and behavior, or how thoughts and behavior are kind of responding to the structural forces in play. And so for the last part, this kind of middle section of the paper, what we're looking at is the interplay between the macro, kind of top-down point of view, and the micro, the bottom-up point of view. So here, sometimes students get a little bit confused because you think you're repeating yourself with the earlier conversation of structure and agency. So we're looking at 2 different questions. The first question basically is, how is the action being produced? Well, the action of people consuming certain things is based upon people knowing the culture and knowing how to play that cultural game. When we look at macro and micro, we're looking at basically a different question, not looking at how the action is produced, but basically the directional focus of the framework. Is that framework taking a top-down focus, how culture provides you the rules of the game, and that kind of shapes how you play the game? Or is it focusing more on a micro level from the bottom up, how people are aware and recognize the culture, and how that kind of shapes how they play the culture as a whole? So, it's not going to be one or the other. There's what we call this kind of interplay between the 2. So basically discuss, those connections between our thoughts and our actions, and kind of what's going on that macro level, the culture, the capitalism, the groups. And so an easy way to kind of lend your earlier conversation of structure and agency to this conversation of macro and micro levels is to basically refer to what you talked about before. So if you talked about before how capitalism as a new mode of production kind of dictates people concentrating on wealth in a capitalist society. And basically, you can refer to that part of your paper and say, here, he's taken a macro top-down perspective. On the other hand, when I refer to people being aware of the rules of the game, it's a more micro approach because he's starting at the level of awareness and kind of bringing that up to the culture that's kind of reflected in the mind of the individuals. So, an easy way to kind of write this part without feeling like you're saying the same thing over again is recognizing two things that you're, basically answering two different questions. The first question being, how was the action produced in the theory? That's, a result of structural forces and forces of agency. Those two come together to create the action. And then the second question, what is the directional focus, top down, bottom up? That's getting at the macro, micro levels of action. So, take that approach and you should be in good shape. But like I also recommended, feel free to refer to earlier parts of your paper and say, here, when I talked about capitalism shaping the symbolism, it's a macro top-down approach. Or here, where I focus on the individual kind of playing the game in response to the cultural settings, then I'm taking a more of a micro approach, focusing on the individual and how the individual is responding to the culture as a whole. So I think that it's a good way to give you the proper foundation to approach the paper with these first parts here. The summary people typically do well on, but it's these three parts: the construction of reality, the structure and agency, and the macro, micro levels of discussion. Those things are where people kind of separate themselves from other students. You typically get the majority of the points, or when you lose points, typically it's in with this section. So make sure that you're focusing your time on this and you do well. Cite the text, fully explain your ideas, and you should be in good shape. So these last parts of the paper, usually people do well on. And again, like I mentioned before, because I'm saying this for our own good, usually when people are losing points here, you're simply not developing your ideas. Perhaps students are taking it for granted that I've read the book and I kind of know what you're talking about, but don't do that. Again, approach it as, somebody who's reading it has never read the book. So you need to fully explain your ideas for them. Secondly, sometimes you get to the bottom of the paper and you're approaching a deadline or you're just getting tired of all the thinking and writing that you're doing. So, just make sure that you're fully explaining everything. Don't stop short just because you're tired, you want to get over with, because when you start to do that, that's when you start to lose points, points that you shouldn't be losing because pretty easy points to earn in this last part of the paper. So basically I ask you to look at two previous course theories. So basically any pre-Veblen theories we talked about in the class, and compare and contrast. So what are some similarities compared to an early theory? What are some differences compared to early theories? And so again, explain your ideas. If you say it's similar to Durkheim because they both focus on culture, okay, that's a good start. So elaborate on that. What is the focus on culture for Durkheim, and how is that similar to the focus on culture for Veblen? Or on the other hand, you can look at how similarity with the Adlers. They both focus on micro levels of analysis. Okay, that's a good start, but fully explain that similarity. And the same thing for differences. If you highlight a difference, explain kind of what that difference is in comparison to Veblen, but also the other theorists as well. So for example, Weber, talks about class and status like Veblen, but he also talks about party. So you could say similarities, they talk about class and status, but differences, Veblen doesn't talk about party. And then you kind of elaborate on that discussion. So next you get into basically connecting Veblen's book to life today. So our current life today, whether it be locally, nationally, or globally, and how can we relate the ideas from the book to our lives today? And I think, this is pretty easy again, just as long as you fully develop your ideas, you know, the role of consumption and status today, the role of leisure and status today, the role of work and status today. I think, maybe some of the ideas are imperfect, but I think a lot of the ideas are still compatible to how we live our lives today, again, whether it be nationally, globally, or locally. So finally, I ask you to come up with a discussion of what you would add or change about the arguments. So again, what you would add, you kind of tack on something, add on something that you think would make it better, or what you would change, what you would tweak, perhaps what you would take away, but again, to make it a better argument overall, make it a better book overall. So again, fully explain your ideas here, and you should be in good shape. Where people sometimes lose points, and so make sure not to do this, is don't say that I wouldn't change a thing. First of all, that's kind of the easy way out. I'm not asking you about that. I'm asking you what you would change. Secondly, there's no perfect theory. So everything we read this semester, I think you can find ways to make them better. So that's what I'm asking you to do. What would you adjust about the theory to make it a better argument today if you had the ability to do so? So, basically that's what I wanted to do, is walk through this with you, kind of hopefully start to lead you in the right direction, hopefully start to have you think about it in the correct ways. And I always say, take advantage of the opportunity for me to, read your paper before you turn it in. I'm more than happy to look at drafts of papers, whether it be full drafts of papers or just a partial draft. So for example, if you did that first part of the paper where people typically will lose their points, if they do lose points, I'll be more than happy to look at that kind of first part of the paper if you'd like me to. So I'll leave that there for today. And as always, please get in touch if you have any questions, and I will see you soon.